All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending part 2 of the trial of the 20th century, Nuremberg. Last week went over over some of the causes of this, and I went into the various theories, racial theories, some government theory, the economics going on at this point, coming out of the 19th century, but especially into the racial theories and the political theories that were arising here, especially in Europe, and especially with some of the German theorists, philosophers, and this will come to fruition here with the Nazi regime. And again, I think I brought up last week what Hitler once wrote in Mein Kampf. State boundaries are made by man and changed by man. We National Socialists must hold unflinchingly to our aim in foreign policy, namely to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled upon this earth. And that you will find in Mein Kampf. There is some truth to that. Man does arrange borders. Man does change borders. The Versailles Treaty being an example of that. The Austro-Hungarian Empire will no longer exist after June 28, 1919. You're going to have many new countries: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland will be brought back, Yugoslavia, so on and so forth. And so, but this also leads to because of the fact the Versailles Treaty failed to ensure the peace. Of course, that's owing to the British, the French, and other nations as well. I always maintain that if the British and the French were that enamored with democratic precepts, they would have helped a fledgling form of representative government take root in Germany, and they did not do that. And so this is going to lead to Hitler, so on and so forth. But when you go back to the Nuremberg trials, and as I mentioned last week, they opened up on November 20, 1945, and will continue on until the spring of 1949. But on the morning of November 20, 1945 at Nuremberg, 10 o'clock in the morning to be exact, 23 defendants filed into the courtroom at Nuremberg to begin these trials. And one of the star performers here, if you want to use that term, was Hermann Goering, former chief of the Luftwaffe, one-time heir to be the Führer, founder of the Gestapo, was also chief of the Luftwaffe, liar par excellence, and also when the Nazis got into power, one of the biggest looters of museums and so on and so forth in Europe, museums, so on and so forth. And he, by the way, was also got to be the star defendant of the trials. Ernst Kaltenbrunner will also be on the dock, the chief of the RSHA after Reinhard Heydrich had been killed. You will also say Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher was a low-rent, bottom-feeding, belly-scraping, pornographic editor of Der Stürmer, which was a low-rent publication featuring Jewish people in the most pornographic of situations. It was a propaganda rag of the most sordid variety. He too will get his neck stretched at Nuremberg, and justifiably so. To give you a little more on Julius Streicher. He was, without a doubt, one of the most sordid of all the Nazis. In fact, to the extent that many of the other Nazi bigwigs really didn't want to pal around with them. If Nazis don't want to pal around with you, how bad are you? And so this was some of the cream of Nazi gangsterdom that will be brought to trial. There were others who formed the cream of Nazi gangsterdom who were not at Nuremberg. Adolf Hitler, for one. Hitler will commit suicide in the bunker, and him and Eva Braun, his bride at that time, will have their bodies burned. Joseph Goebbels, liar par excellence, propaganda chief. Also, Goebbels is an interesting character, knew how to manipulate public opinion, probably one of the best educated of all the Nazi bigwigs, went to 6 or 7 different colleges. He made a comment one time when the Nazis took power, they'll have to carry our bodies out before we will leave. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Only him and his wife will go the same route as Hitler. Their bodies will be burned, as well as their 6 children. You know, as Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their 6 children will also be poisoned like themselves, and even the family dog. Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's personal secretary for the second part of the war, Bormann was on that list of considered high criminals. He will, by the way, nobody knows for sure what happened to him. He was in the Berlin at the last roundup when the Russians were breaking in, and it's not known whether he died in the rubble or escaped to this day. But he will be sentenced in absentia to death at Nuremberg. You know, but the thing about the trials here too, and I'm going to get into this, is that there were some who thought that why are we trying war criminals? This hasn't really been tried before, or how can we try people for war crimes and crimes against humanity? War had gotten to an extent at this point that it needed to be done. It was long overdue. You know, plus there are those in this persuasion of thought that if we don't, Europe is going to degenerate into like on steroids with what went on in Sicily. You know, in Sicily, and Justice Robert Jackson's going to bring this up, that on Sicily for generations there were families that had vendettas going. Well, picture this on a continent. Not just an island, a continent. And Justice Robert Jackson will bring up the point that, you know, I mean, some Allied airmen who parachuted after their planes had been shot down over Germany had been killed by farmers. Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, will never see a courtroom. He's going to be shot and hung upside down in front of a Milan gas station. Him and some of his followers, including his mistress, Clara Petacci, who, when Mussolini was going to get gunned, she jumped in front of him and took a few shots, but it's not going to save him. He's going to be executed anyway. So this is what people like Justice Robert Jackson, Sir Hartley Shawcross, another judge, wanted to avoid. But you know, if you don't do this, if you don't instill rule of law, what's left? The jungle law. And that will not set well here. And so by contrast here, you find that in Nuremberg, yes, the victors will dispense justice. All right, I agree with that. But considering this type of war, and they're going to be, and these trials are an aspect of international jurisprudence that will not attempt to put an end to a war that started in 1939, but in 1914. Anyone who's attended my talks or taken my classes understands that I do not hold to World War I or World War II. There's only one war here. And the European colonial powers started this. They set the stage. And that war is from 1914, 1922, not 1918. And then 1931, 1945. And so this war, and this war also marks the end of the imperialist powers of Europe dominating the globe. It's over by 45. And 2 new countries, the 2 countries that win this war, will now erect a new balance of power. Those 2 countries are the United States and the Soviet Union, and that means what? The Cold War. You know, many of you lived through that period. But it's interesting that so the Nuremberg trials were not so much a gesture of vengeance as it was another aspect of trying to resurrect a peaceful, bring around a peaceful Europe, a restructured Europe, one that will not be a proving ground for war, as it was between 1939, 1945, 1914, 1918, and even some of the wars of the 19th century, some of the short, sharp conflicts. But war at this point is now industrialized war, it's commercialized war, it's corporatized war because of the Industrial Revolution. You know, you're able to have more factories, you're able to have more weapons. And as technology evolves here, each new mark of weaponry will reap an ever greater harvest of humanity. Hence, you need to conscript entire populations. One feeds on the other, and now the casualty lists are off the chart. Over 70 million Europeans are going to be gone here within these two conflicts. I mean, that's unreal. That's unreal. But this is industrialized war. And so we have to forge a new system of international jurisprudence to try to rein in the effects of this. And that's exactly what they're going to do. And so early in the war, the second chapter of the war, that is, Hitler invades Poland with Stalin's connivance on September 1, 1939. But he's going to be able to take control of most of Western Europe by the summer of 1940. Britain holds out, Battle of Britain, they survive the Blitz. However, Britain will be home of many governments in exile as these countries are taken over by Nazi tyranny. They open up governments in exile in Britain. For instance, the French Committee, Luxembourg, you will see Greece, Norway, Yugoslavia, Poland, Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Belgium. And so these are some of the countries that are going to set up governments in exile. Well into 1940, into 1941, these governments in exile are getting reports from agents, people who escaped and whatnot, of Nazi atrocities, deportations, and other rounds of unpleasantness emerging from Nazi control. And so by 1942, they are going to form an inter-allied conference, inter-allied conference. And this is to investigate war crimes going on behind the Nazi curtain. And this is going to begin to come formalized here. On January 13, 1942, it's known as the St. James Committee, the St. James Declaration, pardon me. And then Britain and the United States are going to get involved in this. They can't be left out. And so now this is becoming now more and more formalized. In fact, in 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt will make an announcement from the perspective that when the war is over with, people or those who committed atrocities will be due for a comeuppance when the war is over with. Now, that's a pretty tall statement coming from a president of a country when they're not yet winning the war. However, having said that, they're setting the stage for where the victorious allies are going to go with regards to rule of law. That's supposed to set the allies apart from the fascists, the Nazis, the militarists. Rule of law. And that's where the country's going to go. Now, in 1942, actually, you're going to see the fruition of this in 1945. A new organization for international peace, known as the United Nations, is being formed. And this is supposed to take over from the defunct League of Nations, which turned out to be a failure. It didn't stop war, but that was to be expected. Because the Versailles is probably the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. But here we are looking at something new. And so they're going to formalize what these governments in exile were putting together. And then they're beginning to collate information, accumulate evidence on what's going on behind Nazi-dominated Europe. And this is going to be called the United Nations War Crimes Commission. You are now seeing the first real solid initiative of this thing that's going to be known as the United Nations. They call it the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Now it's becoming Now it's becoming better organized, and it's going to be sanctioned. And when you're going to have countries like the United States, Britain, let's throw in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And how about the Soviet Union? Now the Soviets want to take part in this. Obviously, they don't want to be left out. They don't want to be left out, especially from the perspective, let's say you can't leave the Soviets out because they're the ones by 1942 who are really doing 95% of the fighting against the German army. You know, they're going to win the land war, the Soviets. We aren't, the British aren't, the Free French aren't, the Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians. We're not going to win. They are. They are going to beat the German army. And by beating the German army, they win the land war. Of course, that allows America to do almost everything else. But they will win the land war. And they're going to pay the price for this. They're going to do 90% of the fighting and 90% of the dying. And Lend-Lease was only 10, 12% of the Soviet effort. Soviet industrial production is one of the biggest secrets of Allied victory in World War II. So it's the United States, this gets back to what I said earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union were the big winners of this war, especially the United States at this point. But the Soviets want to take part in this United Nations War Crimes Commission. Now it's interesting when these countries are going to vote on this, Stalin brings up the fact that, well, how about having the 16 Soviet republics voting separately? No. How about if Roosevelt brought up that we have 48 states? How about each state vote separately? You think who else is going to dominate this, right? That's what Stalin's looking to do. And they tell him no. And so the Soviet is going to vote as one nation. However, they're going to take part. They're going to, Stalin's always looking to take advantage of something. That's what Stalin, he's an opportunist. But they're going to take part in this. But the Stalin is also going to put together another commission. And this will be called the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission to Investigate War Crimes. That's what this will be called. But they will take part in the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Now, they are, as they begin to accumulate data and bring up evidence on war criminals by the end of 1943, getting into 1944, they've already got 2,000 names on a roster with collated evidence, much information they're going to be using during the trials here. However, in 1945, April 12 to be exact, Franklin D. Roosevelt will die. He will die, and President Truman takes over. Truman's going to appoint a justice here for the United Nations War Crimes Commission from the United States. His name is Justice Robert Jackson. Jackson was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. He was also, by the way, a big proponent of rule of law. And there are still those who are opposed to the trials. The French, for instance, bring up, again, I brought this up earlier, but they bring it up. How can we try individuals for war crimes? This really hasn't been done before. Justice Robert Jackson counters that, well, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to do this. One of the major reasons is to avoid collective guilt. By that, I mean, go back to 1918, 1919, when you had the capitulation of Germany. And the Allies made a mistake here. They did not fully occupy Germany in 1918, 1919. They won't make that mistake in 45. Another aspect here, the Allies wanted the dissolving of the German General Staff, which was a veritable institution in Germany, and Hans von Seeckt, who, if you do not know who he is, and you're interested in this period of history, I'm talking after the First World War through the 1920s, that's a man you need to know. Hans von Seeckt. He was the commander of the German General Staff. And he was the Allies want the dismemberment, dissolving, the eradication of the German General Staff, considered an institution in Imperial Germany. Von Seeckt's not going to do this. What he is going to do is he's going to tell the Allies virtually, yeah, we got rid of it, but he renames it the Troop Office. That's an innocuous name, which lends to the unreality here of just this office moving people around. That's not what's happening. This is still the General Staff, and it survives. And so you don't have the total occupation of Germany. The General Staff will exist. And this is going to help undermine representative government in Germany. Plus, it doesn't get the help from the British and the French, who are interested, especially the French, in the reparations, getting the money back. And so that will help lead to the rise of Hitler to power here. But at the same time now, yeah, the general staff is going to be eliminated. That's coming. But here we see that they're beginning to formalize these trials. But at the same time, Justice Robert Jackson is saying, we don't want collective guilt of Germans. We don't want another rise of Hitler. What we want are Germans that will remain in the Western fold. Really, this is what this is. But we will convict the war criminals. That's where we're going here. Convict the war criminals. Not hold the entire population to account. And that knocks the French out. Of course, the Russians are still bringing up, well, we know these Nazi criminals are guilty. Let's just shoot them all. Okay, you know they're guilty, but at the same time, that doesn't make the West or the Allies any better than the Nazis. And so Justice Robert Jackson's counter argument is, no, we know they're guilty, but we need to try them. We need to have a form of international jurisprudence which acts under rule of law. We've got the evidence. We know many of them are guilty of waging aggressive war, deportations, murder, you name it, extermination. We know that. But we try them. We save the information and we save the evidence and archive it. And then after they're executed, we save that. We save all that evidence for future generations. That's what we're doing here. It's worth the effort. It truly is. And so in 1945, when this is about to take place, so it's interesting here where this is going to go. However, one place where you might, if you're truly interested in more on the Nuremberg trials than what I'm giving you, one place to go is Yale University. The Avalon Project and the Goldman Library. Many documents, such as the Versailles Treaty and other agreements and accords in history, are archived here, as are the Nuremberg trials. You can get the entire structure of the trials here if you're into this. And anyone who's taken my classes or other my talks knows I go here. And so I print out some of the documents. It's a good place to go. It's a good resource if you're looking for a resource on international accords, treaties, so on and so forth, like the Versailles Treaty, but also, by the way, the International Military Tribunal. Now, it's interesting, the Nuremberg Trial Proceedings, Volume 1, the Charter of the International Military Tribunal. Part 1, Constitution of the International Tribunal, featured 5 articles as to basic structure and the intent of the trials. Then there was Part 2, the Jurisdiction and General Principles. And I'm going to limit this to Article 6. We'll be here all day if I go through all this. Article 6. This is the meat. This is the meat here. Part A, crimes against peace. This is what they're going to do. Namely, planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression or a war in violation of international agreements or assurances, or participation in a common plan or a conspiracy for the accomplishment of any of the foregoing. B, war crimes, namely violations of laws or the customs of war. Such violations shall include, but not limited to, murder, ill treatment or deportation of slave labor or for any other purpose of civilian population, or in occupied territory, murder and ill treatment of prisoners of war, or persons on the seas, killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of cities towns or villages, or devastation not justified by military necessity. C, crimes against humanity, namely murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not in violation of domestic law of the country where perpetrated. Leaders, organizers, instigators, and accomplices participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the foregoing crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any persons in execution of such a plan. Now, what they're doing here is they have outlined the various crimes. The major criminals will be tried at Nuremberg. So-called lesser criminals will be tried in those areas where they perpetrated their crimes, whether it's in the Soviet Union or if it's in Poland, if, in fact, to give you an example, Germany will be divided into 4 districts: the Soviet zone, the American zone, British zone, French zone. In the British zone alone, you couldn't do all this at Nuremberg. You just didn't have the time and space. But in the British zone alone, between the time the trials start, November 20, 1945 to spring of 1949, in the British zone alone, 356 trials and 1,000 defendants will be tried. That's just in the British zone alone. So that gives you an idea of the gravity and the magnitude, the scope of this effort. However, how do we get to this though? I'm going back to something, and by the way, I sent the Darien Library the handout for this for weeks 1 and 2. There'll be a separate handout for next week, which is about T4. I call it Killers in the White Coats. This part of the handout is called The Trap. If you want this handout, you can contact the Darien Library. If they don't have it, I can always resend it. Or you can contact me yourself. My email addresses would be the Darien Library is free to give away my email address and if you want to email me, go ahead, but reference this talk or the Darien Library. I note this end of this handout known as The Trap. And The Trap goes back to June 1934. Ernst Röhm, S.A., the S.A., the Sturmabteilung, Hitler's beer hall brawlers, his working class militia here. And in the beginning of 1934, they are well organized. And the German army expresses concerns. The German army had to adhere to the Versailles Treaty and were limited to 100,000 men. That's it. The German army's capped at 100,000 men, the German Navy 15,000 men. Hitler's beer hall brawlers, led by Ernst Röhm, have 3 million men. 3 million. And Ernst Röhm will write a pamphlet, National Socialism and the National Socialist Revolution and the SA. I have this pamphlet, I've read it a number of times. He says in this pamphlet that the way to spread National Socialism through Europe cross borders is with this People's Army he commands, okay? Now, that sounds a la what you would read in the Communist Manifesto, Workers of the World Unite, or the Trotskyite type will spread this doctrine cross borders. That's what he's professing, Röhm, as part of the National Socialist movement. He's kind of the so-called, if you want to use the term left wing in Nazism, like Otto Strasser, Gregor Strasser, that doesn't set well with, and Hitler's a little on the fence with this, but the businessmen, the bankers, the army, the last thing they want is a German army commanded by a rampant homosexual. Many of these are Prussian aristocrats to the right, you know, the old line Prussians from Imperial Germany, and they're not for this. And so there's something's going to happen here in April 1934, known as the Deutschland cruise. It was a cruise out into the North Sea. And the Deutschland, by the way, was the sister ship of the Graf Spee, if you remember the story of the Graf Spee. And aboard are Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Lord of the SS, representatives of the German army, maybe a few bankers, businessmen, and they urge Hitler, you bet you want our continued support, you better rein in Rum. That's the message. And so here again, you know, like in this country, you know, what you saw on January 6th, that's the lumpen proletariat. That's the gutter that raided the Capitol. The bigwigs don't do that. They do. This is what you're seeing in Germany. You better rein them in, or else we're not going to support you. Well, the bankers supply the money, the businessmen supply the money, and the army. Hitler promised he would take care of the army. Well, you better take care of it. And so you got to take care of this working class rabble. And that's exactly what they're going to do. And so on the night of June 30, July 1, 1934, it's known in history as the Night of the Long Knives. And this leads to the rise of the SS. And that night, Heinrich Himmler, the SS, they will crack down and decapitate the leadership structure of the SA. And upwards of 1,000 will be apprehended, arrested, or shot. Rum will be one of them, actually at a place called Bad VC, which was a hotel, rest cure, sanitarium. And Hitler came charging into Rum's room, screaming and yelling and waving a pistol. And Rum is dumbfounded. What did I do? And Rum's going to be hauled off and taken to a jail cell at a Stadelheim prison. And Theodor Eicke was one of the 2 SS officers who did this. Theodor Eicke will later be involved in the concentration camp program. And they leave a pistol for Rum in his cell, and Rum yells, well, if I'm going to be killed, have Adolf do it. And Eicke and his companion leave the cell. They wait 10 minutes. They go, because they haven't heard a pistol shot, they go back into the cell, and Rum stands up, and he says, if I'm to be shot, have Adolf do it. And so Eicke and his companion take out their pistols and they do the job. But many of the big wig leadership, the high-ranking leader, SA, are purged. On August 2nd, 1934, this is like what, 5-6 weeks later, President Paul von Hindenburg dies. Hitler's the chancellor. Next day, following day, he's going to take the office of president, the office he occupies, chancellor, put them together, and he will be known as the Führer of the Third Reich. And you can make that the official day of the end of the Weimar Republic, although it remained in form at best, but it was over anyway. And Hitler now needs to make sure these people stay with him. And so an oath of loyalty will be taken by government civil servants. And this is that oath. I swear, I shall be loyal and obedient to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, respect the laws and fulfill my official duties conscientiously, so help me God. What about the military? Well, that's no problem. We already have a military oath here. And this is the military oath. The SS have already sworn an oath, so that's not an issue. The oath of loyalty of the soldiers of the armed forces will be, I swear by God this sacred oath, I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German nation and people. Note this, the Führer of the German nation and people, supreme commander of the armed forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. These people, let's stick with the army in particular, are mouthing an oath to a man, not the fatherland. Because if you've watched any of these speeches that Hitler used to give, you know, and then Rudolf Hess, the lackey, would get up and he would yell, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Hitler is Germany, Germany is Hitler. This is what they're swearing an oath to. That makes them culpable for the resulting crimes because they swore an oath to this man, and now they're going to have to reap the comeuppance. He's dead. He took the coward's way out. He committed suicide. Now these people are going to have to pay the comeuppance. That's the trap. And the first verdicts are handed out September 30, 1946. And these are some of the verdicts. Hermann Goering, chief of the Luftwaffe, early member of the Nazi Party, close confidant to Hitler, and one-time heir to become Führer, conspirator against legitimate government in Germany, the Weimar Republic. Let's understand that one. This has not been brought up by many of your journalists. I'm bringing this up. That one of the reasons Goering is sentenced to do the hemp tango or go to the gallows is because he overthrew a representative form of government, an elective government with a constitution. Does that bring it back to January 6th, folks? Or how about those 13 merrymakers who were going to kidnap Governor Whitmer, take her to Wisconsin, try her and execute her? Does that give you an idea, perhaps, of what should be considered here for people like this? If this is at Nuremberg, and an aspect of international jurisprudence, which understands what Goering did and the need for such punishment as the rope, what do you think? Should this be considered here? Think about that tonight when you're having dinner. Maybe you ought to wait till after dinner. I don't want you to get sick. But Goering cheats the hang. He will also be convicted for waging aggressive war. He will cheat the hangman. He's sentenced to death, and he will take cyanide in his cell. Rudolf Hess, early party member, Hitler's personal secretary, deputy Führer, sentenced to life in prison. He is the last inmate of Spandau prison. Many of the others who had been in Spandau had long been released or died. The United States, Britain, and France, they really wanted to put him in better surroundings and close down Spandau prison. Guess who wanted to leave him there? If you guessed Moscow, you're correct. The Russians did. They're considered communists. He's a fascist. Let him rot. And so he'll never get out of that prison. He'll be the only one left. And I guess maybe he couldn't take it anymore because one day when he's 93 years old, they'll go into a cell and supposedly he hung himself with an electrical cord. Hans Frank, murderous governor of occupied Poland, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, minister of interior, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, remember him now, low-rent degenerate publisher of Der Stürmer, death by hanging. Walter Funk, one-time minister of finance and president of the Reichsbank. He will be sentenced to life in prison, but then transferred to a hospital because he got sick. Fritz Sauckel, if you've never heard of him, he's interesting from the perspective of what he did. Number one, he was Gauleiter of Thuringia. He was a district leader of Germany. But he was plenipotentiary for labor recruitment, and it perpetrated slave labor in Russia and other nations. Found guilty, death by hanging. Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff of the German High Command, Armed Forces, and chief of the High Command, Department of the Land Forces, found guilty of waging aggressive war, death by hanging. Martin Bormann, he was sentenced to death in absentia. Joachim von Ribentrov, Hitler's foreign minister, who began his political career really as an ambassador to Nazi Germany in London. But he was Hitler's foreign minister from 1938, 1945. Of course, in a previous life, he was a champagne salesman, but that's not going to help him. Death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, field marshal, chief of the German High Command, Armed Forces, February 1938 to May 1945, convicted on the guilt of waging aggressive war, death by hanging. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, organizer of the Anschluss with Austria and Germany, SS police leader in Vienna, Later, head of the Reich Main Security Office, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, Nazi Party theorist, head of the political section of the Nazi Party. Minister of the Eastern Territories from 1941, May 1945, death by hanging. Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U-boat forces, later Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, he got 10 years in prison. Erich Raeder, Grand Admiral Raeder of the German Navy from 1928, 1943, sentenced to life imprisonment. Sentence was reduced, and he will be released from Spandau prison in 1955. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Austrian Nazi politician, and served as Reich Governor of Ostmark or Austria. Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands from 1940 to 1945, found guilty of deportations of Jewish people from the Netherlands to the east, death by hanging. And so out of the 23 men, 11 were really sentenced to death. 12 actually sentenced to death, by the way. Martin Bormann in absentia, and Hermann Goering, who committed suicide. So 10 will have to be hung, and they will all be hung the same day, October 16, 1945. Now, it's interesting what happened to the bodies. Number one, the United States Surgeon General wanted the brains. They were going to do research on these war criminals, their brains. And that was turned down by the military tribunal. As you know, these guys go to the rope hole. They're going to be processed whole. They are going to take pictures of the bodies, unclothed and then clothed. The bodies will then be loaded on a couple of trucks. This will help form a military convoy, which will be heavily guarded. It will leave Nuremberg. The convoy will proceed to Dachau, one of the first of the concentration camps. The officials are going to fire up the crematorium, which was used to burn bodies during the war. All of those taken from Nuremberg who were hung, including Goering, who committed suicide, their bodies are going to be burned. The ashes will be collected, put back in the trucks, taken to Munich, and sprinkled into the river near Munich. That's what happened to the original defendants who were tried and found guilty and executed at Nuremberg. Now, these trials will proceed, and there will be at least a dozen trials at Nuremberg, various trials. And I'm going to go into the factors for a couple of these in the next 2 weeks. That will be, I call killers in the white coats, the doctors, the Einsatz group and the action groups in the East. But then the lesser criminals, and I can't leave these out because they're important. One man of particular concern here was on the run for several weeks after the war was over with. He'll be captured by the British, and he will be interrogated in the British zone. He will later be sent to Nuremberg, and the Americans will interrogate him again. But being interrogated by the British, the man was from the SS, and he quite freely acknowledged what he did and even signed off on it. The man's name is Rudolf Hoess, Hoess, if you've ever heard of him. He will be sent to Nuremberg. He will be interrogated here, and then he's going to be sent to Poland. And it's the Poles who are going to try him. March, April 1941, he will be given command of something that's renowned through history. And he will command that until the end of 1943. It's called Auschwitz-Birkenau. He readily admits exterminating some 2 million people. And in Poland, as he's being tried, and you know he's going to be sentenced to this, sentenced to death, and he will be executed. But he writes his memoirs. And I have his memoirs. He wrote, they were published in the mid-1950s, 1956. It's called Commandant at Auschwitz. If you're interested in getting that book, you can find it online. I'm sure Amazon or some bookseller can find it for you. It's an interesting book to read. The man had a very perfunctory attitude towards his job. You know, maybe at work by 8, come back home at 4:35, that was the kind of day he had, play with the kids, tend the garden, be with his wife, and then back at it the following day. Very perfunctory. This was what you saw here. Using the railroads to move people, processing them at the concentration camps, the death camps rather. There's difference between concentration and there's a difference between concentration and death camps. This was the sordid use of the Industrial Revolution, where you're taking the hair from some of these people for stuffing, for pillows, the tattoos used to make lampshades, the gold and silver fillings removed from the teeth and sent to the Reichsbank. It's one of the most draconian versions of capitalism you will ever see, the Industrial Revolution. It's a fascinating process. It's to get to know. I'm not asking you to it because it's a pretty sordid topic. But he will be executed for this. Rudolf Hoess, interesting man to get to know. With regards to another so-called lesser criminal, Otto Ohlendorf. Now, Otto Ohlendorf is one of those people you would probably wonder, well, he was trained as a lawyer, went to a couple of universities, very intelligent individual. Why would he get mixed up on this? The Einsatz group and the action groups, especially, they're gonna really rise to the occasion on the Eastern Front. They were really put together at the end of 1938, and they are going to be used in Czechoslovakia in March 1939 to crack down on the intelligentsia in Czechoslovakia, what was left of Czechoslovakia after Hitler got done dismembering it. They're going to be used again in Poland. The Poles really take it on the chin, because not only did the Nazis kill a lot of the Polish intelligentsia, but so did the Soviet NKVD. And there's nobody here to help the Poles. In fact, that brings up Katyn Wood. When that was unveiled in 1942, there were some 15,000 dead Polish intelligentsia buried in the pits, shot by the NKVD. But it's on the Eastern Front that the Einsatzgruppen, which are comprised of Einsatz commandos, action groups, really rise to their heights here. There were 4 such groups: Einsatzgruppen A, Einsatzgruppen B, then C, and then D, north to south. Ohlendorf was in charge of Einsatzgruppen D, and they followed the German spearheads east into the Soviet Union. And their job was to round up all the Jewish people in their section, in their districts, and then shoot them and fill up the pits. Also, they were ordered, according to the Commissar order issued by Hitler, to kill all the Soviet political and especially military commissars that they find. Shoot them all. That's called the Commissar order. And it's estimated by Justice Michael A. Musmano, who was in on the trial of the Einsatzgruppen, that between June 22nd, 1941 and halfway through 1942, these men shot upwards of 1 million Jewish people, or 1 million victims. Could have been Communist Party commissars too, but most will be Jewish. And if these people, Jewish people in particular, were considered Untermensch, subhuman, then one has to question why there was a high rate of alcohol and drug abuse among the shooters. Apparently, they're not killing subhumans, they're killing human beings. But many of these guys wound up as drug addicts and alcoholics. It's one of the most sordid pieces of brutality perpetrated by the Nazis in the entire war. I understand that, the popular notion here is the gas chambers, but the shooting of men, women, children in the pits, they're going to be finding, and you go back to the Russian Civil War, World War II, they're going to be finding pits in the old Soviet Union and Russia itself for a long time to come, if they ever find them. Millions have been shot and killed in the pits, and not counting the Nazis. Although there are people who fall through the cracks. One of them that which I never could understand why he was never brought up on trials is Joachim von Ribentrop, Joachim Peiper, pardon me, Joachim Peiper, from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. And he'd been on the Eastern Front. He was brought 1944 to the Western Front. He will lead the SS Panzer Spearhead during the Battle of the Bulge. Those who are familiar with the Battle of the Bulge probably remember reading about the massacre of American soldiers at Malmedy. And there was also American soldiers murdered at Stavelot, plus Belgian civilians. That was Peiper. You know, we can't wait. We have a schedule to keep, but we're not going to take care of prisoners, and they shot them all. He will never be brought up on trial for this, and he virtually got away for a while. He's living in France in the 1970s. In 1979, keep in mind, this is 35 years later. He's in a little general store in a little French village he's living in. And he buys his goods and he leaves. The store owner thinks he remembers him. And the store owner, after Peiper leaves, goes into his back room and he pulls this book off the shelf over his desk. Opens it up, it's a mug book. And he's thumbing through the pages and sees this picture. It's him, it's Peiper. And this guy, the fellow that owned the store, had been a member of the French underground. And of course, he calls the boys. And 4 weeks later, Peiper must have known something was coming, because they're going to find him on the front porch of his house with a rifle, shotgun, and pistol. And he had more holes in him than a screen door. They got him. This is precisely the type of behavior that Justice Robert Jackson wanted to avoid. This is why you had Nuremberg, as was put forth by Sir Hartley Shawcross and Michael Musmano. This is rule of law. You know but the thing is, you know many of these guys are guilty, but you have to go through rule of law. That's humanity, it's justice. And it's not going to get much better than this. Now, there are going to be some that say, well, it's the primacy of the victors over the vanquished. I'll give you that. But you have to, who would you rather have won the whole war? The Soviets? No, rule of law. Isn't that what we are supposed to be based on here? Yeah, that's the importance of Nuremberg. If anybody has any questions or comments or observations to make, you're welcome to make them now. Yeah, getting to the doctors, let's start there. The Germans started on this road with sterilization, sterilizing people who were considered mental incompetents, criminally insane, maybe youngsters who had Mongolism, or who were borderline juvenile delinquents. Get a load of that one. At the same time, they're going to, and then they're going to go from that, and I'll get into this next week with killers in the white coats, how they go to, using the needle, lethal injection to get rid of them. And then the gas chambers. What I'm going to describe next week was the basis of the final solution. They form it here. But they're going to say, well, sterilization had been outlawed in Germany, yet in the United States, here we go. You go back to 1908, 1909, states like Illinois, Indiana, California, Virginia is one of the first, Connecticut was one of the first, who were going to sterilize people for being criminally insane, maybe not having all their marbles, mentally incompetent, perhaps. And by 1939, this country will have sterilized over 30,000 people. And that's going to be part of the defense. They also are going to bring up, well, how can you talk about extermination when what did the white man do here to the Indian? But that's not going to stop the trials. I mean, what we did to the Indian is horrible. I mean, that's horrible. But the Nazis took capitalism and industrialized murder is what they're doing. And so, Justice Robert Jackson's correct. We have to have some sort of organized effort to bring rule of law back, or else we're going to have chaos, pandemonium, additional murder. And it was the correct course to take. But some of the Nazis are going to say, well, the United States engaged in sterilization. The United States, the white man over in the United States there killed a lot of the Indians. And they're going to be correct. But then again, where does it stop? I mean, actually, the Germans on the whole, of course, the Luftstalags, the prisoners of war camps holding Americans, Brits, Free French, Canadians, was run by the Luftwaffe. And maybe 1% of Allied prisoners died in their hands. That's not what happened with the Japanese. Yeah. They didn't give a hoot about Americans, the Dutch, the Brits, the French, the Australians, New Zealanders. They didn't care. They worked them to death. It's estimated. I've seen. It depends which source you go to, but some 27% of American POWs died in Japanese hands. So, yeah, they did have the trials, the Tokyo trial, but it wasn't as elaborate as what went on in Europe. Germany was occupied by the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. We occupied Japan. No one else is. We do. And we will really be responsible for the trials. And so, we're going to take control of Japan. And one of the reasons for that is Korea, because it points like a knife blade at Japan. And, at the time they're thinking, when the Soviets get involved in the land war in Europe, where does that stop? We don't want another face-off in Europe. So you drop the bombs, you end it, but we take control of Japan because Korea can be that stepping stone onto the mainland. Here we go again with the American Empire, the Philippines. We took the Philippines because that's a stepping stone towards the Asian mainland. Well, we're in Japan now, but we're going to control Japan. And so we're going to conduct the trials. But some of these guys are going to be killed, like General Homa, General Yamashita, so on and so forth, for these crimes. I mean, you didn't see this in Europe, but in Japan, and it's in Knights of Bushido, written by Lord Russell of Liverpool, who was one of the judges. Some Japanese were convicted and executed for eating American and Allied prisoners of war. Yeah, you had cannibalism at Stalingrad, but these are starving Germans. Some of these guys that did that in the Pacific, they weren't starving. So you got to stop this stuff. You can't fool around with it. People like that, do you really need them? I mean, let's be honest. Do you really need them?
Nope.
No. They forfeited their right as human beings by doing that. Try them in a court of law. I give you that. And then let them do the hemp tango. Let's get it over with. Anyway, now that I ruined your afternoon. But yeah, I mean, this idea of using religion is the last refuge of a scoundrel. It is. This so help us God stuff, or a providence helps us. I mean, give me a break. As Marx once said, religion is the opiate of the masses. The same time, the Israeli secret agents got Eichmann and then spirited him out. They were supposed to get Joseph Mengele too, but he got tipped off and he went out the back door. And so they'll never get Mengele. In fact, Mengele made repeated trips back to Germany all during the post-war period. He came from a family that owned the Mengele Tool Company. In fact, I think it's Mengele who forms the basis of the story where Gregory Peck, remember the boys from Brazil? I think they took that character of Gregory Peck from Mengele. Well, no, he was the one that met the trains at the siding at Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Okay, those who look good for work can go to the right. Those who, we don't need these people. They can go right to the left. Many of these fellows that they brought over here had a certain talent, whatever that talent was. Like maybe some of these guys who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Army. The United States military was looking for any way they can get information on the Soviet Army. And so if you knew a German soldier who had been on the Eastern Front, well, perhaps, or an SS man, well, perhaps we'll give this guy immunity if he can, turn over intelligence on the Soviet Army, because now the Cold War's starting. Emil Durkheim wrote a book called Suicide. And the book is not just about individuals committing suicide. How about nations? How about a nation that no longer has a functioning economy? Its culture can be called into question. It's society that can be called into question here. And so what do people do? They begin to rip it apart. This is national suicide. Is that perhaps what you're seeing here in Michigan and January 6th? Because you don't have a functioning system of representative government. You don't. And so is this a reaction to that? I say yes. And an economy that some of these people feel they're ostracized from, a society they feel they're ostracized from, a culture they feel they're ostracized from. That's who joins some of these groups. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for them. I'm asking you to try to understand why they do what they do. And so it's interesting what you see when you go back and you read Emil Durkheim's book, Suicide. It's a fascinating book to read. It does give you somewhat of an insight, another way of looking at it, except besides being historical and politically, astute about this. What about the emotional aspects here? We kind of forget that sometimes. We kind of forget. That's not to excuse these crimes. That's not a bit of it. But if we want to eliminate it, or at least cut it back, we have to know this too, I think. Why do societies do? Now that's the old question here. Gee whiz, the Germans are so intelligent. They're really organized. They're hard workers. Well, why would they do that for? I mean, that's a question you have to ask. And I remember a fellow, he's gone now, Ed Connors, he was in Patton's Third Army. He fought in France, Belgium, and Germany. And he told me, he says, you know something? He says, we were in France, and he said, I saw these French people, and he said, they're in all this rubble, and they're not doing anything to clean it up. He goes, what a bunch of GD pigs. Then he says he was in Germany, and he says, in the middle of defeat, in the middle of all this rubble, you got these Germans out there, and he said he noticed a lot of ladies out there on the stoops and the sidewalks, sweeping all the dust and dirt and the garbage off. Let's start with the sidewalk to the house and all this rubble all around them. He said, again, here we are. They're organized. Even though they lost, many of them they're cleaning off the stoops and the sidewalks before they clean anything else off. Fascinating. Truly is. It's fascinating. So, so when you read Durkheim's book, Suicide, it kind of gives you a different side of this. The idea of a national suicide. That's like cultural suicide. It's societal suicide. It's emotional suicide. You give up on representative government, or the old way is gone. Let's rip it apart and try to bring it back. You're just sacrificing your country for this. But again, go back to what I said earlier in that handout about the trap. Keith brought it up. They took this oath, government functionaries, soldiers, and they're not taking an oath to the fatherland like many Jewish soldiers did in the First World War. You know, there were Jewish soldiers and upwards of 100,000 Jewish men in the German army in World War I. Many of them were more German than they were Jewish, for Pete's sakes. I'm fighting for my Kaiser and my fatherland. What happened here? And no, they're to blame for we lost the war. Yeah, okay, if you want to believe that one. Them, Democrats, socialists, communists, and the inveterate Jew. Now here we go with that. To me, that's just an example of Christian inadequacies. That's what it is to me. Partly. That's part of what this is. And so this ongoing saga of lacing the Jewish people over, it's tedious over and over and over and over and over again. Let's grow up here. Jesus, Christmas sakes. You know, and then many Jewish people after the war. Well, we don't want this to happen again. Yet what happened in Cambodia? Pol Pot. What happened in Africa? The Hutus and the Tutsis. What happened when Yugoslavia fell apart in the 90s? It did happen again. It seems that man can't get off this merry-go-round. You know, and then you get people, sober thinkers like Justice Robert Jackson coming along, Sir Hartley Shawcross, people like this, and we're going to try these people as an example for the future and collate all the evidence and make it available for the future generations. Make the evidence available and the court proceedings available. What else do you want them to do for you? And then it happens again. And what does it say about the human condition? Oh. Oh. Anyway, you're still going to get Germans who aren't going to like what happened. In fact, when my father worked for Tower Optical in Norwalk, you ever go to the Empire State Building or Niagara Falls? You see those viewing machines. It used to be a dime, now it's 50 cents. Yeah. And you look for 2 or 3. My father put a lot of those in after the war. And the fella that used to be up in Niagara Falls, his contact man, was a man by the name of Matty from the Niagara Falls Park Police. His brother-in-law was a man by the name of Hans. He was in the German Navy in World War II, and didn't like Hitler, so he came here to the United States after the war. But his sister was before, during, and in the post-war period a die-hard Nazi supporter, die-hard Hitler supporter, and said he's right. And he was telling me in 1969, when I was about 17, 18 years old, I was talking to him about this. I found it fascinating. I said, have you seen your sister lately? He goes, I haven't seen her since 1955, I think it was. You know, she disowned her brother. And but he said, as far as I know at this point, she's still undying supporter of Hitler and the Nazi agenda. Never gave it up. So you're obviously not going to please everybody. But then again, you know, when you look at Germany, yes, it worked because the Allies occupied Germany. So that helped. But the other side here is I always remember a conversation that there's a book called Conversations with Stalin. It was written by Mia von Gies. Gies was a close associate of Joseph Tito, Yugoslavia. He had a falling out with Tito and wound up in and out of Tito's jails in the 50s. But he was a prolific writer and an excellent political theorist from the Marxist perspective. But he remembers he wrote this book called Conversations with Stalin. And him and Tito were having a conversation with Stalin in 1945. And Stalin said that many are under the mistaken impression that the Germans are down and out. He goes, the Germans are among the world's most organized, most intelligent, and most hardworking people. They will be back in 15 years. You think he wasn't right? Of course he was right, because Germany was a thriving country by 1960. Interesting. Interesting perspective. Interesting perspective.
All right, then. Well, thank you, Mark, for another wonderful talk.
Oh, you're more than welcome. It's a lot of fun.
All right, and we'll see you next time.
See you next week.
Okay.
Same bat time, same bat channel.
All righty. Thank you.
Have a good evening and stay well.
You too.